Have you seen that sort of get more strategic or grow beyond just the accounting function?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually think that's actually one of the biggest misconceptions I think about revenue accounting in general is we're sort of seen as this back office function, right? We're just the bean counters, just deal with it, deal with accounting for it after the
Hmm.
fact. But I think it's understated just how much data we have access to as accountants. Like this,
Hmm.
we have access to just a wealth of data that I think just gets underutilized. It's just static data that sits there underutilized when, especially in the world we're in, where you have the Googles and the Facebooks, where everything is just so data driven. To not utilize that data in a strategic fashion, I think it's I'm trying to think of the best way to put it, but it's a missed opportunity, I'd say.
Hi, welcome, David. Thanks for joining me today. I'm excited to have you on with me on the record. We've had a couple of conversations here around RevRec and the impacts it has around processes for accounting teams. Excited for you to be able to share your insight with the team and the listeners here today.
No, excited to be on it. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Now, I understand this might be your first podcast recording. Is that true?
That is true.
All right. Now,
Very
knowing
first.
that, do you listen to podcasts?
Too many. I have a huge backlog of podcasts
Please
that I listen
share.
to. So there is obviously Joe Rogan. There's also, I don't know if you're familiar with Rewatchables. It's a Bill Simmons podcast where they go
No.
over like classic movies and just kind of they have like a list of awards. Who's the over actor in the movie, and it's a lot of fun. So that's one I listen to on the regular. See Conan O'Brien's podcast. I listen to him because I love Conan. I used to watch him way back in the day when he was still in New York, actually.
Likewise. Likewise. I didn't even actually realize he had a podcast, so I'll have to check it out. Well,
Um,
one of the questions I love to ask every guest, so would love your take on this. I've recently said we haven't had the same answer twice, is around how you refer to the holistic revenue process. So, in my past, I use order to revenue, quote to cash. I've now heard lead to revenue. I've heard lead to reporting. How do you refer to that holistic process?
Quote to cash.
Quote to cash.
Personally, but I've heard the gamut. I typically, if I hear a prospective client or a client use a specific terminology, I try to stick to that. But
Hmm.
you ask me a question out of the blue, first thing that comes to mind is quote to cash.
I like it. I like it. It's after my own heart, so I can appreciate that for sure. So tell me a little bit about your current work. Like, what is it that, if you can explain to the listeners, a little bit about what you do and the types of clients you work with at CFGI?
Sure. So at CFGI, we primarily serve as a partner to the CFO and like to function as an extension of our client's organization. So it's a number of things. If you could think of it, we probably serve that problem, whether it's technical accounting, operational accounting, tax, audit, IPO readiness, the gamut. A few years ago, we did launch a technology practice. So that includes cybersecurity, business transformation, which includes revenue automation, which is the area I currently specialize in.
I love hearing more and more companies, service providers, consultants starting these revenue practices because it's such a big topic and used to just sort of be lumped in with all accounting practices. But it truly is, especially now with all of the different ways in which companies can go to market. And so it's been interesting to see over the years the shift in how it was just once part of the accounting function and now is almost a function of its own a lot of times. And around that, what do you see as some of the top challenges that you help most of those revenue accountants, and what is it that you're oftentimes going in and helping with?
So it's accounting for it properly where there is no system solution. So it's either we're dealing with bad or no data at all, which is probably the biggest issue we come across because it's really hard to put your fence around it.
Hmm.
It's almost like an oil spill. You can clean what you can see, but there's no telling the amount of damage that's underneath.
I like
Um,
that. I'm going to use that, by
so
the way.
you could take it. I'm pretty sure I'm not the first person to come up with that. So absolutely. So yeah, I'd say that's probably the biggest challenge I see across the projects that I work with.
Yeah. Now, how do you approach that? Just kind of curious, like, do you find times where you go in and maybe the data challenges are even greater than you initially suspected? How do you kind of diagnose that and dive into that?
So really taking a step back and maybe put the audit hat on, how do we best assess this from a risk and materiality perspective? Where are we
Mhm.
most vulnerable? Where is the risk that we're dealing truly with just bad data? And how do we go about ensuring that it's complete and accurate?
Yeah. And do you have a way in which do you have like a tool or a solution that you use? Is there something internal to CFGI? What do you guys typically use from a data, say, cleanup perspective or even detection perspective?
And so we do have a group within CFGI that specifically deals with data issues. But we do have a team specifically that deals with data issues and throwing it into a model and trying to isolate those issues. So we do have that at
Oh,
CFGI.
interesting. Yeah, it's something that I see time and time again as one of the biggest challenges. And a lot of times the thing that slows down projects or initiatives the most. Um, Business requirements and those business requirement gathering phase usually seems pretty straightforward. It's when you go in to start building out that what that looks like in the design phase of it, um, where then we start to sort of bubble up and say, "Oh gosh, we've got problems here, there, and everywhere," and it kind of feels like a pull on a sweater. You start to pull on that thread, and before you know it, the sweater's unraveling quickly around data and what else it is. You said oil slick or an oil spill. I've also heard it referred to as as an iceberg. You can see the tip, but under the water, you have no idea just how big it is. So, with your current role, director at CFGI, what are some of those recent challenges that you have faced? Like, is there a particular project recently that you've had, or a client that you've worked with that really stands out? And curious how you kind of worked through that with them.
So one that immediately comes to mind is so the company was undergoing a revenue automation project. We weren't involved on the outset, so they had gone through business requirements. The configuration was ongoing, and one of the requirements was customization to essentially calculate SSP the
Hmm.
exact same way they were doing it in their Excel models because they had large deals.
Mm-hmm.
I say small number of large deals, but very material deals. So,
Okay.
and they wanted SSP calculated a specific way, and they wanted the tool to do it the exact same way. They were running into issues with this customization. So they brought us in to help and try to troubleshoot and kind of lend some guidance. Ultimately, what we determined was that the SSP, how they were calculating SSP in the models, was actually not according to guidance.
No.
So they, so
Surprise.
they, surprise, this customization that you asked for that the vendor, put, hours in trying to develop, and you're currently having troubles with isn't according to guidance. So that's essentially ultimately where they had to do is modify that customization so that the system was actually built to handle SSP out of the box, right? Let's first understand and make sure that let's rule it out that that's not what you're looking for. And if it isn't what you're
Mhm.
looking for, why isn't it what you're looking for? Is there something specific about what you're doing that's, I'd say, more aligned with guidance than what the system is? Because often, more times than not, right, these systems are built to be able to manage that and be agile enough to deal with however you calculate SSP, whether it's percentage of list, you got a specific price point, whatever it is, it's there to manage it.
And it's interesting when you were talking about the customization piece of that, it made me think about how many times we've run into situations where it feels like customization is sort of like the path of least resistance, right? Like it feels like, oh, if I can just solve for this piece of it and I'll just sort of, create this code that should handle it for me.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, when you've got those customizations, what that does is it kind of captures that point in time, but it's not necessarily something that's agile, which I just heard you use that word is, it's very static to whatever that need is right then and there. And imagine if that client had actually gone through and been successful in their A, customization, but then B, figured out that it was incorrect and then had to go back and fix it. That's even harder to do. So I think it's a great point around out of the box functionality, and curious your thoughts on something related to that. I believe sometimes clients just want to try to automate whatever it is that they are doing in a spreadsheet, right, wrong, or indifferent. And so I think,
Yes.
it makes sense. They're just kind of thinking, well, these are the things that I do and these are my processes and this is how I book it today. But then when you really pull it apart, it's sort of like that may have been created by some sort of process over time. It's sort of like bubblegum and sticky tape. Like, well, at one point in time, it looked like A, and then it sort of like transitioned into B, and now we're on to like D, E, F, and so on. And so it's interesting how some of those processes that a lot of times I hear clients and customers trying to solve for may not actually be the right path. And so when you look at what is the out of the box functionality, it's probably there for a reason. And does it mean maybe to undo some of those things that were done unnaturally at the time and could be done in a much better way? Like, do you run into that at all? Is that something that you help clients work through? Like, how often do you see that?
I'd say more often than not,
Mm-hmm.
it's definitely the biggest struggle, right? Because no one likes change, right? They know they know what works currently, but right, they're not really thinking about, is there a better way to do this?
Mm-hmm.
Which ultimately, right, the systems are meant to be able to capture that, and then also be agile enough if there's a change down the line, shift in strategies, whatever it may be, that you have something that will be able to seamlessly make those change versus, to your point, unwinding the customization and you're kind of stuck with functionality at a point in time.
How do you help your clients collaborate with other departments? Maybe it's like sales, marketing, product management, something like that, along with revenue accounting to see how they can become like really help drive that growth and help be partners instead of sort of just receiving whatever it is that gets, pushed through from those upstream teams?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think working with, to your point, with working with the finance team to be able to, build or have available forecasting to make some of those strategic decisions. I'd say working with the marketing teams, if there's a marketing deal that they're working through, is there a 606 impact to consider, right? We should, as revenue accounts, we should be at the forefront of those discussions versus having to deal with it at the back end, right? Right? We entered this contract, figure out how we account for it. We could have been inserted in several places before it got to this point where it could have been easier to account for, maybe done a different way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where sometimes I don't think accounting is necessarily thought of as strategic, just, right off the bat. But truly now we're seeing, as you do have these initiatives, maybe through technology or process improvement, where it's giving the accounting team a different sort of spin. And now they are being more strategic partners overall, which for me is exciting, given that, coming from a world where early on in my days, I spent a lot of time in spreadsheets, just pulling a lot of data and pulling it together and then feeling like I was just pushing it out and maybe felt more like that bean counter versus, you know, over time as my roles sort of transitioned into something that was a little more tech related, gave me the opportunity to explore some other areas and really be more of a partner. And curious if you've seen a shift also in the clients that you work with in a similar way over the years as tech sort of has created this transition or this shift if there's anything that you've seen as far as what you've been able to help with, maybe what the accounting teams or the teams that have engaged with you to help them. Like, have you seen that sort of get more strategic or grow beyond just the accounting function?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually think that's actually one of the biggest misconceptions I think about revenue accounting in general is we're sort of seen as this back office function, right? We're just the bean counters, just deal with it, deal with accounting for it after the fact. But I think it's understated just how much data we have access to as accountants. Like this, we have access to just a wealth of data that I think just gets underutilized. It's just static data that sits there underutilized when, especially in the world we're in, where you have the Googles and the Facebooks where everything is just so data driven. To not utilize that data in a strategic fashion, I think I'm trying to think of the best way to put it, but it's a missed opportunity, I'd say, for
Yeah,
sure.
I think it's a great point. And I'm wondering too, just as you're talking, helping these clients through whether it's a automation project or some sort of tech implementation. What's sort of the follow-up work that you see coming out of that? I imagine it doesn't just stop at go live. What's the type of follow-up work that CFGI and your team does to help? Like, is there? I assume there's some bit of it just supporting the initial go live, but then do you find that there are projects that come out of that as well, as far as like from a strategic standpoint, now that some of that data may be more open to the revenue accounting teams?
Yeah, absolutely. So post implementation, there's always, especially in a environment market where there's a lot of acquisitions, right? Often companies acquire a new business and then want to onboard that company onto the platform. There's always additional work there. And to your point, finding better ways to make use of the data that's available, right? One of the huge benefits is the real-time reporting that's available using these platforms. So no longer are you waiting on reporting, weeks lag. Now you have it. It's literally real time, and it's available for you. And to be able to use that and interpret that to make strategic decisions, right? See how are you selling specific products when you bundle product X with product Y? Can we use that to shift selling strategies? And the one benefit with the platform is that you are, and I keep harping back to the word agile, because I think that's actually probably the biggest benefit, is to be agile enough when those selling strategies do shift that you already have a system in place to be able to handle it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, as you said, selling strategies, there's also with that agility, there's also the ability to be able to test some of those, right? And so I think sometimes there's a fear to test out new strategies if there isn't a way to easily shift from A to B or
Yes.
whatever needs to be done. And so I do see there being more flexibility in reacting to what the end users actually need. Like, we need to be able to be flexible enough that we know how somebody wants to buy. And so being able to make sure that the offerings are set up to allow them to do that in the way they want to. And so having that agility, again, just kind of helps all around. So curious a little bit around how you and your colleagues stay up to date with the latest trends and best practices in the industry. I imagine, you guys have to be at the forefront of everything going on, so that you can help your clients. But how do you stay up to date with those trends?
So, keeping up to date with webcasts, covering current events impacting businesses globally. But I'd say the best way where I'm most stay up to date is in speaking to clients and prospective clients, right? Hearing what issues are at the forefront of their mind, right? One of the hot topics, and I'm sure you've seen recently, is around consumption billing, consumption revenue. I swear, it's like every client I speak to nowadays, it's always, does the platform account for consumption billing, consumption revenue? And I'm sure before that there was some other topic that there's always something new. So I'd say that's probably the best way, is just seeing what's on the forefront of our clients' minds.
Which is really interesting because it almost drives. It's kind of like social media if you think about it. It's,
Yeah.
whatever somebody starts doing. And so
Mhm.
it's interesting how even with accounting topics, it can be the same thing. Like you just said, consumption. It feels like it's making its way into every conversation today, that we're all having. And I think it's almost like a bit of FOMO sometimes. If one customer hears somebody else, maybe their competitor doing something, or even just another company that they hear of trying something new and they want to do the same, and then it catches on so fast. So you guys almost have to be not just hearing what it is, but then hearing what it is, reacting and helping out immediately around all of that, which is really interesting. And on that same topic around consumption, because it is so hot right now, what do you think is the most challenging part about consumption for revenue?
I'd say how you track consumption. How do we, from a systems perspective, track that, and then are able to recognize the appropriate revenue based on that consumption, right? What's the
Mhm.
budget? How do we set that? It's more so the data elements behind that I think are probably the most complex. But if you take a step back, consumption billing isn't really, I mean, it's not complex of a topic. It's really more so just from a systems perspective, how do we track it and account for it?
Yeah, exactly. And all the variability, when you've got those levers of when you reach a certain level, maybe the price changes. If there's a certain amount, that there's a minimum amount that they must use, or whatever that is. So to your point, it's that tracking capability to then be able to react and handle the accounting to that. And it is all based upon the usage piece of that. It's
Yep.
literally the definition behind consumption. So it's really interesting. Um, do you find that more clients are trying to handle that initially in a manual fashion? I imagine it's so difficult and probably doesn't last very long. But how far can an accounting team or a revenue accounting team take it in a spreadsheet with consumption? I imagine it breaks pretty quickly.
Yeah, that along with modifications are probably
Mm.
the two biggest to be able to track manually in an Excel spreadsheet. Um, especially if you're dealing with a large number of contracts, tracking usage, consumption, or contract modifications along the life of that contract becomes unmanageable at that point.
Yeah, exactly. And not just the transaction volume, but then you have the usage and consumption volume on top of those transactions that are
Yeah.
consumption based. So it's almost compounding sometimes when you think of it that way. So, how do you at CFGI measure the success of the financial consulting services that you provide? Like going into a project, how do you set up those measurements? And then how do you measure at the end how successful you were in that particular project?
Measure success by the value we generate long after we rolled off.
Hmm.
There's obviously the immediate value that we provide, but is that a lasting, right? Is it going to continue to serve that work that we did during that implementation or whatever the project was, right? Did we provide value that lasts long after that? Because that's always top of mind, and that's really how we generate our business. It's really right. Customer was happy with what we provided. They're still using it at that point, and they call us back to come back and help with some other issue that they're coming, some other brand new accounting topic that comes to mind, whether it's consumption billing or anything else. It's really what keeps clients coming back to CFGI.
Exactly. Now, I'm curious just because of those topics and the transformation over time of what the latest trend is. We talked about consumption. I have to ask, have your clients started to dive into the AI world yet, or is everybody still sort of cautiously awaiting what's coming on that front?
I think there's still a bit of cautiousness around AI. I think on all fronts. I'm sure in a decade from now we'll be using some element of AI But to what extent, will they replace our jobs? I can't say. Not the subject matter expert on AI, but in my mind, and this is the way I think, maybe the incorrect way of thinking about it, but let's just say AI is able to, right, interpret the guidance in a particular way where it's, well, however AI interprets it, that's the rule.
Mm-hmm.
You're still going to have four different opinions on how to interpret AI from the four big four accounting firms. So it's in my mind, accounting is you can't eliminate the subjective nature of it. While I'm sure we will incorporate some element of AI, to the extent, I'm unclear.
Yeah. I think it's one of those things too where I'm hopeful it can help us take care of the more mundane tasks that nobody really wants to do anymore and take care of those, much like automation has, over the years. But there's something, especially in your line of work too, where the judgment and expertise that comes from the services you provide is something that really, and again, I'm not the expert here either, but I find would be very difficult for AI to learn, especially in any short period of time, because of that judgment aspect to it, because it's not necessarily cut and dry. If it was, we'd all probably be out of jobs already because
Yes.
it would be so easy to automate some of these things. But because revenue is such a gray area where company to company, it needs to be so specifically consistent, but company to company can be a little bit different. Just, needs to make sure that whatever those policies are, they are being strictly adhered to within the company.
Yeah, I say I can confidently say no two companies handle the exact same topic the same way. It's different company to company. It's part of what makes doing what I do interesting. It's something different and company to company, and the problems are slightly different, right? You're trying to solve for the same thing, but there's always different variables that are impacting how you go about it.
Absolutely. Sort of the snowflake effect. Hopefully we can keep these companies snowflakes so we can keep you guys busy.
Yes, AI, the just pushing buttons and doing that, right? AI can handle that, but to your point, where it comes time to making judgment calls and I think that's better left to the human element. And I feel like I read somewhere a little while ago that AI, I don't remember whether it's ChatGPT or one of the others, that they took the CPA exam and failed.
They did. I heard the
Yeah.
same thing. Something I keep in my back pocket just to make sure we can all make ourselves still be able
Yes.
to sleep at night a little bit more until they can catch up to us in that way. All right. So, final question, David. What do you think's the one stereotype about accountants that you feel like may not be true for people, right? Like bean counters, and we always get such a bad rap. But like, why do you think that is? And what's that stereotype that you feel like is just not true?
The one that always gets me is the one that all accountants are tax accountants. We're all tax experts, right?
Yeah.
Any tax question I get asked, that's the one thing I get asked about it most is tax. And it's probably the least out of all the accounting topics, is probably the one I know least about. I have a base knowledge, but I use TurboTax myself.
Likewise. My grandmother
So
used to actually ask me to do. She's like, "You're an accountant. Can you do my taxes?" And bless her heart, I didn't have or the opportunity or the heart to tell her no. So every year I would do my grandmother's taxes in addition to my own.
I, same with me. My parents, they asked, "Oh, you're an accountant. You should be able to do our taxes." I'm like, you can't say no. So it's like, all right, sure, I'll do it.
It's a whole different ball game.
I know. I'd say I probably circle back to what we were talking about earlier, where revenue accountants aren't just some back office function. I think it should be looked at more involved in the strategic aspects of the company, right?
Mm-hmm.
Given that our access to data, given how we're able to have dynamic forecasting available to us. To your point, right? Test specific selling strategies within a platform. So I think all of that, right, leads to revenue accountants being more involved with the strategic aspects of a particular company.
Yeah, could not agree more. And I'm sure all the listeners agree wholeheartedly as well. So, David, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a true pleasure chatting with you, and we look forward to having you back again.
Likewise, Lynn, looking forward to coming back. And again, thanks again for having me.
This podcast is brought to you by Zora Revenue. Automate revenue recognition for any business model, enabling your teams to reconcile and report on revenue in real time.
Listeners, my DMs are always open to you. Please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn at mdaigle, that's EMDAIGLE, and follow me for insights that help accounting leaders grow in their career, modernize their teams, and ultimately become more influential partners in business. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.